Now, I think when we talk about productivity, a lot of people don't. Education doesn't come to mind first of all. It's not that people think of tax. People think of government spending. Really kind of hard economics topics. But you note that education is a key priority. What is it that makes? Why is it that we need to focus on education as a source of long-term productivity growth?
And it's not a coincidence that it's the first item in our first chapter in the Green Paper. It is the fundamental. Education is the fundamental. I'll tell you why. In previous days gone by, there was a theme that we should asset recycling. That assets should be recycled to be more productive. Instead of having stagnant assets on the books, we should recycle. The theme coming through the Green Paper is moving on from asset recycling to asset utilisation. How can we use the existing assets, both public and private assets, better? And assets are not just physical assets. They're not just intangible assets. They include human assets. And so everyone thinks, as you're quite rightly, about regulation and et cetera. And with infrastructure assets, with physical assets, people say, yes, they can be used better. We've got roads that are empty half the time. Why don't we spread the usage across? We've got buses that are empty half the time. We've got buildings. We've got operating theatres that are empty. Why can't we spread that? So physical assets, yes, we can utilise them better. Intangible assets, information, we can use that better, and some of our recommendations go to that. But I'm a firm believer that human assets are the key. If we can equip our workers to be more productive, then we're going to get a lot more done. I mean, everybody knows that the American workers on average can produce in 4 days what it takes the Australian worker 5 days to produce. Now, if we can go somewhere towards their level of productivity, now it's not just the skills, it's also capital, it's also regulation, etc. But skills is a major one, and that's why both at the school level and the vet level, the two areas where the state government has a bit of input, they're a key emphasis.
The state government is the primary provider of education, and the New South Wales Department in particular is the largest educator in the country by some way. I would like to go to schooling first, and I think schooling, again, I think it sent a very strong message with that being the opening chapter or substantive opening chapter. When I came through the report, I noticed that you've really got a discussion around student achievement, a discussion around teacher workforce planning, and a discussion around performance management. If I was to kind of group the major recommendations there, and I think they all obviously feed in, of course, to the question about education outcomes themselves. When we talk about this, the observation you make of achievement for students has this persistent downward trend. Funding has this constant upward trend. And a lot of us will scratch our heads and say, well, we were told, and we've been told for decades now, that more funding is what the school system needs in order to deliver better outcomes. Why is it that we're in this situation now?
Though, for those of you that go online and see our report, we can show that steadily the expenditure per student has increased over the last 15 years, but the PISA results have all fallen. So, and when I say they've fallen on average, Glenn, and that there are some schools where it's gone up. Some areas are doing better. Now, you know what that means. If some are doing better and the average is falling, some are really doing much worse, right? So we've looked at what are the drivers of better education outcomes, and there's a number of drivers, but our conclusion that it is teacher effectiveness that is the key driver. We've got to do more to equip our teachers, our wonderful teachers, to be able to produce better results for the students. One of the things, I'm glad you mentioned the funding going up and down, because with each of our recommendations, we, rather than just giving a recommendation, people say, oh, here's the solution, what's the problem? The aim of the Green Paper is to state what the problem is first, so then people can see. Because I think in days gone by, we've sometimes jumped to a solution and said, look, I've got a solution for you, this is what we should do. And because the public are not mindful of what the problem is, there's not as much buy-in. So what we've attempted to do with each of the 6 chapters, whether it's planning or schooling, or whatever, is to state where there is a bit of a problem.
Mm. When it comes to funding, is it a matter of, so you note that the level of funding changes and so on. Is it something wrong with the way that the funding system's working if this is the outcome? Or is there something else going on?
Throwing more money at things is not my solution. It may be a solution, but it's not the one I'm primarily looking at. I've got 56 recommendations throughout the Green Paper, and hardly any of them require big swags of money. They're more, let's change the regulations, let's change this, let's change that. And with the schooling one, what we're saying is let's recruit mid-career people into the schooling system. Let's have a system where teachers can get more feedback in relation to how they're operating, etc. And let's do more evidence-based research. So my primary aim is not to say, look, let's spend more money on whether it be schooling or on TAFE or on planning or on infrastructure. I'm not here to say let's spend more money. That's for others to do. I do suggest the creation of an instructional lead, a new type of teacher position, because at the moment, while entry-level wages in the New South Wales schooling system are fairly good, comparable with others, they don't go up as you sort of get to the maximum after about 7 years, whereas in the rest of the OECD countries, and you'd be familiar with this, and it can go up considerably over the period of their working career. Whereas in our situation, once a teacher gets to the sort of the top level after about 7 years, to get a pay rise, they really have to then go into more administrative type roles. And we're suggesting the creation of a small number of instructional leads.
Awesome. And you're right, as far as OECD data goes, and there was a new release just last week or so that pointed to this same issue about wage compression, and that we actually have one of the highest starting salaries, but one of the lowest trajectories over the course of a career. And we know that over time, of course, we all seek that remuneration to be tied in some way to our performance, and that seems to be something that's missing here. I'd like to drill down a little bit more on this discussion about the teachers' workforce, because what I noted in the discussion in the paper is a bit of a change in course from what we've been hearing for the last decade or so. So the main point I want to point to there is that you note that a lot of the policy intervention has focused on restricting supply. So this is toughening up accreditation. It's increasing the entry requirements to become a teacher. A lot of things that we've come to the education system is coming to terms with, and educators have had mixed views about. You note that, well, the statement you make is that attempts to improve teacher standards have conflated accreditation with quality. And I think that sort of illustrates that stance of the supply restriction route. You say to boost, what we need to do is boost supply instead. So you mentioned a little bit of there about instructional leads and so on, and that's probably something we'll get to in a moment. But how is it that why would increasing the supply be a solution to the problem?
Well, let's take, for example, maths teachers, right? There is a shortage of maths teachers in a number of schools. Right?
Has been for a long time.
Right, there has been. Now, you've mentioned COVID. Now, there's an opportunity now. There's an opportunity because at the moment, and even before COVID, there were a large cohort of finance executives, middle-ranking finance executives, mid-career, in their 40s, etc., who have expressed interest, I'd like to become a teacher. Now, for those people with a mortgage between 40 and 50 years of age, he or she is going to have to make a pretty big call to become a teacher. So they've got to go for 4 years to study, and then once they've done the study, then they can go teaching. What we're suggesting in the paper is that these finance executives, hedge funds managers, etc., they may know a bit about mathematics already. And so there may be no need for them to learn retrain on all the mathematical side. They should just maybe train on how to be a good teacher or how to get on with parents or whatever. And so instead of a 4-year course, it could be a lot shorter. So that's one of our suggestions in relation to increasing the supply side.
You point to the example of Singapore and it holding essentially an accelerated 1-year certification to become a teacher for people that are already mature age and have already been in the workforce already. What other kind of maths proficient mid-career transitions do you think? So there's the finance executives and so on, but surely there's others that are kind of in more I suppose, run-of-the-mill occupations that might also have the kind of skills that might be
Yeah,
applicable?
well, I'm not suggesting we want run-of-the-mill people in the teaching profession. What we want people who are well ahead of the mill, right? And they're the people who are scientists. They're the people who are in a whole suite of different fields. Mainly, I'm focusing mainly on the STEM side, Glenn, here, but there may be others. But you make a very good point. And I will say, though, that I'll just stress that the 56 recommendations in the Green Paper are not my final recommendations. Exactly the point you've made about Singapore and what are the other ones, that's why I'm opening this up for discussion for the CIS, for others, to let us know which of these recommendations are the right ones, which are the ones that are not going to get legs, and maybe they can fine-tune them. So on your point, it was a very good point. Which other areas rather than maths may be applicable? That's where I'll be starting the conversation and asking the experts, asking others who are a bit closer to it, what areas could there be?
Awesome. And look, that they exist. There's a range of, I think, and I hope that comes up in as part of the further drilling down and recommendations, because I think we're onto something there, that mid-career transition. I agree that there's that employment track, I think, is an important one. On COVID, so you mentioned a couple of times the impact of COVID and the way that's changing some of the conditions that we find ourselves in. What do you make of the adaptation of the education system in schools to COVID and the online delivery and so on? Is there anything you'd like to elaborate on there that encourages you?
I'm very encouraged by many stories that I hear, and it's very difficult for me to generalise. I'm not in the sector. I'm looking at water, electricity, infrastructure, everything. So I don't pretend to be an expert. But the people that have worked on the paper with me are telling me that there are wonderful pockets of innovation that are occurring, and people are adapting, and they've been forced to adapt. I've heard recently that in some of the junior primary schools, some of the students are in fact learning to read, etc., quicker than they were before. Now, I haven't tested that, I don't know. But one of the issues that I have noticed, though, Glenn, is the wonderful resilience of the teachers to be able to operate in this new environment. They have, of course, gone from having very few supervisors or people to give them feedback to every parent in the class is watching what they're doing now. On the Zoom. And so they're getting the opportunity to get a lot more feedback. Many employees like feedback from people, whether they're customers or bosses, etc. And one of the recommendations we've got in there is that there be more feedback from the classroom so that the teachers can hone their existing high level of skills to the next level.
That's a positive note, and I'm glad that there are some opportunities coming out of COVID around teaching, and that certainly supports some anecdotal evidence out there as well. Onto the performance management side, and I think that this was another area where it was very interesting seeing recommendations around improving the teacher evaluation system. Now, performance management has been one of those intransigent areas of education reform for quite a long time. What can you explain to viewers? What is it that you think's missing in that teacher evaluation that needs addressing?
Well, I think as I get all employees I believe can perform a better job if they get feedback on how they're going. They can tweak what they're doing, and so we're looking to see more feedback for teachers. So in classroom observation, some people say for too long teachers haven't been able to get the feedback. Now we're suggesting that maybe someone could be in the classroom on occasions in the right contexts, and that's why we'll be opening up the discussion is how do we go about that feedback. Others are suggesting maybe we get 360-degree feedback on teachers, maybe their peers who are in the classroom next door who hear, maybe the parents, whatever, also able to get feedback. Also looking into the measurement. Now, some people will say a teacher who starts with a cohort which are below par to start with, if they can get them, they shouldn't necessarily be measured by the end result, what happens at the end of the year, because they may have started at a lower point. So we've got to work out a way of the value that the teachers added. I think you made a very good point when you highlighted that the number of degrees or qualifications that teachers have is a factor, but it shouldn't be the be-all and end-all. Just because someone's got 3 master's degrees doesn't mean they're more effective than someone who's got 1.
Quite so. Quite so. For those of us joining us online, please feel free to add questions into the comment box. We can get them to Peter. I'd like to pivot out from schools for a moment and more toward the discussion about VET and skills. In that area, I think this is another sector that's been really resistant to reform and change. I noted that, that this issue about skills shortages that's addressed in the paper, of course, that's something that's been talked about for quite some time. Why is it that so many skills shortages have been with us for year on year?
Well, let me give anecdotally. I mean, there's evidence as well, but anecdotally, skill shortages. There appears to be, one more reason or other, a bias towards university education. They're just, and this is anecdotal, and people have said to us in the consultation, look, if a boy or a girl's parents were in a trade, they would either join the trade or they would go to university. So there were 2 paths. But if a boy or girl's parents went to university, invariably they would go to university. So that generally means that there is less supply of tradespeople coming into the system. That's one suggestion, right? And as it says in our report, there's skill shortages everywhere from air conditioning mechanics to chefs. So there is a big shortage of that. There's also the issue of the dropout rate has increased dramatically over the last few years. People sign up for an apprenticeship and then they don't like it and they pull out, right? So we're trying to look at ways, how can we get a 21-year-old who suddenly changes their mind, I wouldn't mind getting into a trade. It's difficult at the moment because employers would find it difficult to pay adult wages to someone who's a first-year apprentice. So we're looking for ideas in relation to those sorts of things as well. Also, I think we've got to publicise the fact that in a trade, you could financially do pretty well if you wanted to stick it out, if you want to start your own business, etc., etc. We're also looking at tying in closer with Year 11 and Year 12, so they can make a decision at the end of Year 10. I want to stay on and do the HSC, but listen, can I use some of those points for my trade?
So I think that's a really relevant point. Now, the VET's offered in schools, but probably still there. I think that bias that you've talked about, that's now emerging out of successive government reports. That came up in a federal government review, and it's been something that's been spoken about year on year. Is it a matter of what's driving that reputational issue that seems to have impacted upon VET and to some extent to TAFE?
Well, I guess that's one of the reasons we've issued the green paper, to find that out, and then we can address it. I mean, there just seems to, and if we had evidence of that, I mean, you talk to people in the trades, they absolutely love it. They think this is fantastic. Why isn't everyone in it? Well, maybe it's too hard to work there. One of the things we've talked about on with the pandemic, Glenn, is with an apprentice, they have to be employed plus studying at the same time, right? And what we're indicating is that, look, if during the pandemic they've lost their employment, please let them stay on as to do at least the academic side, even if they can't do the hands-on. Pros and cons on that. A number of people have said, look, there's a risk of that. Really, they should drop out of the apprenticeship, because if they're not doing the hands-on, then that's no good. I say, well, why don't we use the opportunity for them to catch up a bit, get ahead on the academic side. But I'm a realist. I understand that you really do have to marry a bit of both. So we're looking at feedback on that.
Awesome. I hope you get the solutions on that one, because it's a biggie. I suppose you touched on this a moment ago, that salaries paid to people in a lot of trade, particularly trades, has as a proportion of vocational trades to university graduates, that ratio is getting closer and closer on average. And many people in trades are earning considerably more than university graduates and enjoy some of the best job prospects in the country. At the CIS, we really value the role of free markets and we see that markets ultimately will match, right? That skills that are in demand will be met with supply. it sounds like there's some sort of failure in this market, for want of a better term.
And I guess when we say the market is different components. You've got the supply market in relation to when they first graduate or they first finish their trade. I think it'd be fair to say when an apprentice has finished their fourth year trade, their wages are generally probably not as high as someone who's just finished dentistry, right, in the first year out. Whereas after about 10 or 15 years, some of the trades roles the wages can increase significantly, particularly if they own their own business. Right? When we also talk about the free market, one of our recommendations, not in the skills part, but in another part, is that we be more open to recognising qualifications from other states. So people who have got a trade from Queensland or Victoria, we're suggesting that we should have reciprocal arrangements where they're recognised in New South Wales. Now, I'm from Holland, and we allow Italian builders and whatever to come in, and vice versa. And I would imagine if we can do it in Europe, and the differences between Queensland and New South Wales are probably not they're no more than between Holland and Italy. Why can't we recognise those? But as you say, there's some people that say, look, the standards in New South Wales are higher. They may argue that. I don't necessarily support that. They say the standards for particular skills are much higher. If we allow people from other states to come in, they don't have the same level of qualifications. Now, I think that needs to be tested.
Now, I think that's something that comes up in teachers' professional standards as well. I mean, it's something that I think you could probably pick just about any industry, and there's some level of regulation that seems to change in different states, and sometimes we wonder what's fundamentally different about them. I was pleased.
Let me give an example
Sure,
on that
go
one.
ahead, please.
With the responsible service of alcohol test. So a backpacker comes to Australia, wants to work in a bar, they've got to do a responsible service of alcohol test. They've got to do one in every state. And so I thought I might go and do the course. So I went and did the course. Here we are, a middle-aged elderly man with all these young 20-year-olds. And I thought, now, why is the New South Wales one so different to the one in the other states? You would have thought if you could recognise one. Having said that, there are slight differences, and there's so I guess we've got to get more data on that to see whether we should automatically recognise. It means the person would only be doing one course instead of 7. So they'd only be paying $180 instead of 7 times 180. That's assuming they want to work in more than one state.
But I think the point's well made that that there are people that for a lot of genuine reasons that will work in different states. As say, teachers is another one, virtually all primary carers and so on. On apprentices, how are we going to overcome this apprenticeship challenge? I mean, you note that the low levels of pay are serving as an obstacle. We've now got additional factors, thanks to COVID, that are limiting the opportunities, particularly to get the hands-on work. How do we get through this? We know we can't allow the system to continue to deteriorate for a number of years, because it's only going to put us in really difficult situations. What can we do now to start solving that one?
Well, there's two sides. One is the marketing, the public perception, but that to a certain extent will only go so far. The other is maybe to make it a little bit easier and quicker to have a trade. Now, this is another controversial one where we're saying, look, instead of a 4-year trade on some of them, maybe it could be done in 18 months or in 30 months. Now, again, the feedback we're getting from people is a bit of resistance to that, saying you can't train a bricklayer or whatever it is in less than 3 or 4 years. Well, let's test that and let's see the data that we're getting. But I think, but also a bit of mobility. Some of the vet courses, for example, when you do the course and then no one advertised they want that. Now, this is not so much a trade, but it's a vet course. So, for example, hospitality. When was the last time you saw an ad for a barista or something that said, we want to see a Cert 3 certificate in hospitality? So generally, or we want someone who's an expert in customer service. You've got to have a degree or a certificate in customer service. A lot of those ones are ingrained, and we probably don't need a certificate for them. probably need more of a certificate in relation to the actual finer technical type skills of being a barista.
Look, as someone who used to run restaurants for a part of my career, I can definitely agree with you that we never would put out an ad and seek someone that has a set of specific that's got a customer service degree. And as you say, I think that's one of those things that's learnt on the job. So, and that kind of gets me to you know, there's a number of the skills list in particular, and some of the course lists that, and what appears to be a number of courses which are also appears to be those that are also attracting additional subsidies and so on, that don't appear to be those that are really valuable to employers. And this means that students are, of course, undertaking courses that might not actually be very useful to them and their prospects. At the moment, we're as part of the COVID response, we've been encouraged to more people to join the vet sector. Is there a risk that these people are going to find themselves funneled towards courses that aren't going to help them ultimately?
Well, that's a real danger. And I think what we've got to do is, I mean, we don't want people doing a course in how to be a typewriter mechanic, for example. I mean, we need to make sure they're current. And one of the themes, then, is who is the customer in education? Who is the customer? Now, is the customer the student? Is the customer the parent? Who is the customer? And I say one of the customers is the future employer. Right? The future employer is a customer of the vet system and even of our schooling system. So we've got to listen more to the future employer as to what skill sets they want. We don't want reams of people coming out to be a certain specific designer and there's only one job coming out. So if we listen more to the future employers, and that's where in some pockets of Sydney, future employers or employers have got together with the schools of the Year 12s and partnered and said, look, these are the sorts of skills we'll want from a non-university type field. Let's work with them, and they've formed great partnerships. And what we want to do is use this evidence-based where things have worked well, roll it out into other ones. There's pockets of absolute real leadership.
Is the interpretation around that to some extent with skills, because of the forecasting nature or the forward-looking nature of making projections about what skills are needed in the future, that you need some level of command and control rather than markets per se?
Well, you need leadership, whether it's command and control. And one of the things we're thinking, you talked about forecasting. If today we had to forecast the skill sets we needed in 5 years, we might be in a bit of trouble. Right? So that's why we're calling for micro-credentials as well, so that someone can do a 6-month course, a university or a TAFE or whatever, and they get a bit of paper that says they've done one component. Now they might start in one line, but that 6-month thing is not. I've just come back. People are pulling out of courses after 6 months, right, or after a year. Some people pull out with only a few months to go in their vet certificate, right? What we've got to do is give them credit for the stuff they've already got. That gives them heart, and then they can build on something else. So if somehow we can work out micro-credentials, even if it's a specific type of software engineering they get a certificate for or something like that, that's much better than saying you've got to do the whole 4 years and then come out and be an expert in everything.
Look, micro-credentials, as you say, I mean, this is sort of the buzzword of the vocational training discussion everywhere, here in Australia and elsewhere, but also something that people are talking about in the context of university education and so on as well, that there's a range of skills. If you want to be an economist, there's a few different things you want to do to become an economist. You need to have a bit of micro theory, then you need a bit of macro, then you've got to do a bit of modeling, but you kind of need to do some of these things in sequence. But you may be rewarded for completing components of that. The risk appears to me, and that if you're awarding micro-credentials on people that are doing trades work, now that's going to make a lot of sense in some cases because we might be talking about relatively simple procedures. But what happens if we're stacking a bunch of what appear to be relatively small competencies together, but we're missing some bigger factor that might be needed on a work site? That might be a safety-related concern that we're putting people onto, say, a job site without having the full training that they need, or not feeling, say, I've got a certain set of qualifications, but I don't want to tell my boss that, hey, I can only actually do these tasks, but not these others. How do we overcome this risk with micro-credentials?
Okay, very good point. So you've got qualifications to do one item. You've done a 6-month course rather than a 4-year course. Now, after that 6 months, if you were sick of it, you'd go and you'd be an unskilled labourer at the moment. And you go on to the boss and say, look, I'm an unskilled labourer. But if we could give you a certificate for that, you could go to the boss and say, look, I'm one step higher than an unskilled labourer. I don't pretend to be a builder who can do the whole lot, but I can do a little bit more than if 6 months ago I dropped out. So you're right, it's not the be-all and end-all. And also there's the danger of all the 6-month micro-credentials adding up together and forming a camel instead of a horse. Right? So
Right.
we've got to make sure that we don't have a person doing aeronautical engineering for 6 months and then basket weaving for 6 months. There's got to be a continuum. But I guess what we're saying is micro-credential is not the be-all and end-all, but is better than somebody dropping out after 9 months and having nothing.
I mean, one thing that comes up in some of the discussion about micro-credentials is to what extent are we just papering over issues with the recognition of prior learning system? Because if we were able to resolve those RPL issues, maybe we don't actually need micro-credentials as much.
Yeah, and some people have said that to us, and we're listening to that. I mean, that's a very valid point. As long as that prior learning is accredited and is consistent, there's got to be a benchmark, a yardstick. We can't say, well, yeah. So that is a very, very good point.
Now, you mentioned an earn or learn strategy, particularly it appears to be very much out of the conditions of the pandemic. What do we mean by what's the earn or learn strategy all about?
Well, earn or learn is in a situation where if you're at the moment, if you're doing both, you're earning and learning. So you're on a trade before the pandemic. So you're working 4 days and you're learning 1. We're talking a situation if you lose your job, you should be able to keep that 1 day. So earn or learn rather than necessarily having to do both. And there's all sorts of more detail in the report about the scope for it. We hate to see the alternative being neither. So people say, if I'm not earning and learning, I can't do anything. What we're saying, you should be able to do one or the other.
Fantastic. We have a question from one of our viewers, Salvatore Babonis. He's an adjunct scholar here at the CIS. Thanks for being with us, Salvatore. He asks, are universities, and I know that universities aren't specifically the remit of the paper, but I hope you can make a reflection on this. Are universities well placed to teach skills, or should they focus on personal development and leave skills training to others?
Well, I think that the start of the point that Salvatore has just made is that the states do schools and vet the universities more. So I'm not an expert, and it'd be remiss of me to be able to try to give an expert opinion. But I think there's scope for all to do more, and I think the universities are working in tandem with TAFE providers, and universities now are providing certificates, etc., and things like that. So, but I'm not an expert on that. It's more a Commonwealth issue.
Do you see more of a kind of integrated model of universities and the vet sector working a bit more closely? That's something that also comes through in Commonwealth reports of.
Yeah, definitely, and I think it's not sort of two mutually exclusive things. They can work closer together, definitely, and even people, just as universities now, you can do some units at one university and get credit for that at another university. So maybe not quite as easy moving between TAFE and universities, but it's something we really should explore.
Definitely. Now, what do you make of this issue about course offerings? And we'll move toward the end before too long. But what do we do about courses that are being offered that aren't really demonstrating value? Is it a matter of stripping those courses? how do we communicate that market signal, I guess, is where I'm coming from. How do we communicate better to prospective students what degrees they should be doing?
Well, we've got to allow that for advise the student and their parents as to the employability after you're finished. So there's a lot of, I mean, everyone wants to be a personal trainer, but I mean, how many jobs are there in personal training? I mean, others are suggesting, I mean, you've heard the concept of securitizing vet, where you get a provider and say, look, if you train up all these unemployed people in this area and whatever, you can keep all the income tax or the payroll tax that would be received from these people. So then the provider goes out of their way to make sure the courses they're going to put on will provide jobs and will create them. Once they've got that income stream, then they can securitise that and sell that off to the market. Right, so we don't cover that in our report, but that's the sort of thing in the future. But I think if we make it make students more aware and that the job prospects of doing something, I think that they have to make their own decision in the end.
Absolutely. William Neal makes a comment more than a question, but thanks for your contribution. Cert 4 in vacuum cleaning to allow work as a cleaner. I think this gets to your point. You used the illustration of aircon technicians, and I thought that was a good illustration. Could you give us summarize, why that was a good example?
Well, the air conditioning mechanic, there's a big shortage of. There's been a shortage for 24 out of the last 25 years, I think. So there's a real shortage, and that is quite an intricate skill. The one that William Neal just mentioned facetiously about the Cert 4 and vacuum cleaning builds on the point you and I both make, and about the barista. You don't need a Cert 4 in baristaism to do that. You choose... You've just got to know the basics. With the cleaner, clearly you've probably got to do the Cert 1 on safety. You've got to do that. You've got to be able to know electricity and a few things like that. But certainly you wouldn't need a Cert 4.
I would hope not. Now, a lot of the reforms, and I've touched on this a little bit, and you've noted it as well in the draftness of recommendations so far, but one thing I think that's refreshing is the boldness of the reforms being put forward. How do we actually put this through? How do we take this through to fruition? So how will the recommendations here? How are we going to overcome some of that inertia within, particularly the education and skills sectors, but perhaps more broadly too?
Look, that's a very good point. And that is the biggest thing playing on my mind at the moment, right? So any taxi driver with an iPad can come up with an idea. Here's a fantastic an idea to improve productivity. It's a matter of having the skills to be able to get the public on board. Now, people will often say, oh, we've got this great idea, but no one seems to accept it. Well, the reason they're not accepting it is because they're not selling it well. And that's why we've used a 3-stage approach for our rather than me coming up with what I think are all the answers. We've had the discussion paper, which sets out various themes, calling for other ideas. Now we've got the green paper with 56 ideas from other people. Now I've vetted them to a certain extent and only put the ones in there which I thought were had legs, had a chance to go further, but they're not my final ones. And then I'm liaising to try to get ownership, to try to find out and to sell the problems and say, look, if we don't do something like the pandemic, people can accept trucks delivering things at 3 o'clock in the morning, making a noise to deliver the toilet paper to Woolworths. People accept that because they know there's a problem. Whether they will accept that in 2 years' time, I don't know. And so to get productivity reforms implemented, it's not a matter of blaming people who don't implement it. It's about soul-searching ourselves and saying, why haven't we made a strong enough argument to be able to convince the opinion makers to do it?
Look, so in a sense, when you're speaking to me, I'm hearing what you're saying about productivity reform, and I couldn't agree with you more. But there are many out there that might say that this is a time that rather than talking supply side, we need to be talking about demand side. We need bigger stimulus. We need government to cushion the blow of recession, and that's the appropriate role for government to play at this time. How do we counter that narrative?
Okay, well, I'm not saying one way or the other on the demand side. I'm basically a supply side person, right? I'm not saying I'm a freshwater economist. I think you guys are. Maybe I'm not a saltwater economist either. But I mean, basically, I'm more supply side. When it comes to housing, for example, affordable housing, I think the real gains are to be made in increasing the supply side rather than giving people a bit of extra money to buy something, right? So there's probably a role for both, but I have a penchant towards the supply side. Now, in relation to the government during the pandemic should encourage more demand, clearly a role for that, and we've had the job, the initiatives, the stimuluses. My goal is to say, look, eventually, if some of this money is going to be paid back, wouldn't it be better if it were paid back from a bigger pie? So if we can make more jobs and then more taxes will be done, be paid. So if we can increase the supply, that will help. I'm not making a comment on the demand side.
Awesome. You mentioned the tolerance for regulation. Now, is this to what extent do you think this is, or to overcome regulatory boundaries? Are there some examples you'd like to share with us that you think are good examples where we can use this opportunity has changed perspectives around those regulations?
Absolutely. I've got a whole chapter that lists all the regulatory reform that's occurred temporarily during COVID, right? So we accept electronic signatures, we accept video stat decks, we accept chemists being able to dispense certain prescriptions, which they wouldn't. We accept the noisy building on Saturday morning of a house down the road, whereas we never used to, right? So people are accepting all that, right? What's going to happen in a year's time? I'm not as confident that people will accept the change as much then, because they won't see the problem as much. So I believe I've got a 6-month window, Glenn, to get all these things up and running. When things stabilise a bit, and I'm not suggesting they'll stabilise properly, there'll be reduced balance sheets around the country. Households will have a lower balance sheet, businesses will have a worse balance sheet, and so will governments. And generally, my experience has shown where the balance sheet isn't as good, people tend to revert back to the status quo. They tend to be, we don't want to make the changes. So I believe there's been some big inroads at state level of regulatory reform. My clear recommendation in one of the recommendations in the report is all these recommendations, all these deregulation, keep them for the next 12 months. When things get stabilised a little bit, let's not make a decision today whether they should be scrapped or they should all be kept for 12 months. And then people have got to put up a case why they shouldn't remain longer, rather than the reverse about saying why shouldn't scrap.
On that note, the CIS, for followers of the CIS, you'll recall that throughout the period of the pandemic, we've identified also a series of regulations that we thought were never needed. And we hope that, to your point, that a case should be made to reintroduce them rather than to remain as they are now. You indicated to us the timeline you're working with. That's around 6 months to turn around your draft recommendations to final. How can members of the public participate and be part of that conversation?
It would be wonderful. On our website, www.productivity.nsw.gov.au, we've got the report. We're calling for submissions. I think the submissions close shortly, but if you write a letter and ask for an extension, I'm sure that no one's going to jump up and down. It's all productivity, isn't it? And we're going to take all those into account. And as I say, I've been surprised by a lot of the things, very surprised. The submissions. Drones, I think I've got a big section in there where I think farmers are only allowed to use drones where there's line of sight. And I thought, well, if you've got 100,000 hectares, you don't want to have to get on your quad bike and drive out to see if the cows hurt himself. You just send a drone up. I thought everyone liked that. I thought there'd be reduced accidents. You could check stock, you could check weeds, you could check water. But there's a large group of people who don't want it. They say, look, it's just too dangerous to have drones where there's no line of sight. So it's good to get feedback from and reality tests from what the public are thinking. So to answer your question, if people can go onto our website, look through the 56 recommendations, comment on one or two of them or all of them, and give us the pros and cons, and maybe help us to be able to market or sell them. Because I won't be putting all 56 in the final white paper early next year. I'll only be putting the ones where we get a lot of feedback on.
Fantastic. That's all we have time for today's episode. Thanks so much for joining us, Peter. It's been really insightful to hear from you. As I mentioned, you can follow Peter's work at the Productivity Commission website. Please do get involved. I think that Peter and the team will be really glad to hear from you. For CIS viewers, CIS On Liberty is back this Thursday in our regular 10 a.m. time slot, and our host Salvatore Barbonas will be there for that. If you enjoyed today's episode, remember to like the video and subscribe to our channel. You can find out more about the CIS or to make a contribution to support our work. You can do that at cis.org.au/support. From all of us at the CIS, we hope to see you again. Bye for now.
All right.